Welcome back to Open Line tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with Hannah Cox, the National Manager for Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Hannah, welcome back to the show. When we met you earlier a couple of months ago, you were with the Beacon Center, but I'm just glad to have you back in this role. We're talking about the death penalty tonight. If you just joined us, you missed Jason Lamb explaining what's going on here in the state this week. This is going to be a big topic you hear about on the news because in just a few short days, on Thursday, Tennessee is scheduled to execute its first prisoner in 9 years. His name is Billy Ray Irick. A lot going on in the court system right now concerning this specific case, but it brings the death penalty back up, and that's what we are talking about on the whole tonight. If you want to chime in, you are welcome. This is Open Line. 615-737+ is the number to call. We'll get to those calls in just a bit. But Hannah, just, you know, the fact of this group that you're with, conservatives concerned about the death penalty, it might stop people in their tracks and say, whoa, wait, conservatives are usually for the death penalty, right?
Yeah.
So what's going on here?
Yeah. When I first heard about it, I thought, what? I encountered this organization about 4 years ago when I was actually doing some work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I had the same reaction. I thought, conservatives aren't against the death penalty, and why would you be? And shortly thereafter, I was asked on behalf of NAMI to work with a mental health coalition in the state that was actually going to be seeking an exclusion from the death penalty for people with severe mental illness. And I said, oh, I don't know if I can help you. I don't think I'm with you. And they said, really? You know, you're such a limited government person. Have you ever looked into this? And the truth was I hadn't. The death penalty is an emotional stance for everybody, and it should be. We're talking about matters of life and death. So I did my due diligence and I started looking into the death penalty, and I was really shocked at what I found. And I found a lot of issues that I think make sense for people under the right-wing umbrella to be concerned about. And they're not your traditional issues that stereotypically you hear from the left or get pegged as bleeding heart liberal issues. There's actually really concrete factors that are of concern to us. So I became involved. Well, first and foremost, the thing that got my attention right out the gate were the innocence issues with the death penalty. And of course, everybody knows that there's some innocence issues involved, but I think probably like me, they thought that was a bit of an anomaly, that it wasn't typical, that maybe here and there people fell through the cracks, but that our Constitution was strong enough to ensure that we did not get innocent people. You know, there's that famous old quote, rather 100 guilty men go free than one innocent person perish. So I think, like me, many people believe that to be true. It's not. We've had over 162 people exonerated from death row since reinstatement in the 1976 era. And while that might not sound like a huge number, it actually equals one person released over an innocence issue for every 10 executions we've had in this country since that time. So if we were talking about any other kind of operation where you had those kind of statistics, it would be done. That's terrifying to me to think that, and that's just the ones we know of. Who knows how many people have actually been executed that were innocent, who are still on death rows that are innocent. I just don't find that acceptable. So that was the tip of the iceberg for me. After that, once I started digging into the system a bit more and found out about the costs are insurmountably higher than pursuing other sentences such as life in prison without parole or life without parole. We're talking at least $1 million more a case, and it depends on the state, but we're talking a lot more expensive to pursue it right out the gate, and then over the course of the years that it continues down this process, the costs just add up. It's not cheaper than other sentences. In fact, 70% of the costs are incurred at the trial level. So just pursuing death is that much more expensive. What that means is not only are we not being efficient and effective with our tax dollars, we're also not pursuing the majority of crimes. You have about a 51% clearance rate for homicides in this country, about a 1/5 clearance rate for property crimes, and as we all know, we've got hundreds of thousands of rape kits that are backlogged. So that's not a tough on crime system, in my opinion. That's actually a really foolish system that lets the majority of criminals go to just try to really stick it to a few small number of people.
Because if you don't know, just having covered death penalty cases, the minute the prosecutor files for a death penalty case and a death penalty sentence, everything changes from that day moving forward in the court system, from the type of lawyer that this person is afforded if they can't afford their own attorney, and it just starts there and continues to mount.
That's exactly right. Death penalty trials are far longer. You've got 2 trials that take place in death penalty trials. So you have a guilt and innocence phase, a sentencing phase. That's way more hours that you're paying judges and prosecutors. It's a longer jury selection process. You're putting the jury up for a longer period of time. You're usually paying for more testimony and and witnesses and labs, and all of it adds up to where it's significantly more expensive. And in fact, the best cost study, in my opinion, in the country is out of North Carolina, where we have the best data, and it found that the trial was actually 4 times more expensive than the appellate process.
And I think at this point we do have to point out there are some people, a lot of people on death row who have committed absolutely heinous crimes, including this Billy Ray Irick, who is scheduled to be executed. He raped and murdered a little girl, a 7-year-old little girl, and no one is denying that some of these people have committed heinous crimes. So some people say, kill them.
Right.
Kill them. They deserve it, right?
Yeah.
And your goal, this group, is not to say, let's let them off.
No.
Not at all.
Certainly not.
I think that needs to be made clear.
Yeah, and I think, I want to say her name. Her name was Paula Dyer, and this is something that really concerns me with death penalty issues, is we spend decades with this person's name in the media and in the news, where they become celebrities, and you don't hear about the victim, you don't hear their stories, you don't hear their names, and what does the family get through all of this? They get dragged through the mud for a verdict that's neither swift nor sure. They don't typically get any sort of counseling or restitution, relocation fees if that's necessary, maybe income for time away from work that might be necessary, scholarships for kids who've had their parents taken away. I just think there's so much better that we can do by victims and victims' families than this system. And for other victims' families who, again, aren't having their killers pursued at all half the time. So I think that it's very upsetting, and we have to remember, some of these crimes are heinous and they're terrible, and we don't want to make any, exceptions for that. I think that they should be held responsible, and we need to make sure that society doesn't have repeat offenders. But there are better ways of doing that that are a much better result. And we see that in the deterrence issues with the death penalty, which was another issue that brought me to my current stance. When you think about spending this amount of money and being tough on crime, you want to at least see results. But we're not seeing those results. In fact, the South, which has the highest amount of executions in the country, also has the highest amount of homicide rates in the country to this day. Whereas when you compare that to the Northeast, that has very low amount of executions, they have very low homicide rates. So I think that in of itself shows that this is not a deterrent, and that there are better ways that we can address cycles of violence in our country.
Let's jump to the lines. We have Bubba standing by. Hi, Bubba.
How are you, young lady?
I'm good. Go ahead with your comment or question tonight.
My comment is I fully believe in the death penalty, just like this guy y'all that's talking about coming up here. That's beyond a shadow of doubt is guilty. You ought to go down like the Titanic, just like some of these other people. There's like this guy that beat his son to death down at Dixon. That's ridiculous to prolong it, simply because look at us taxpayers out here paying all this money, putting up with all this longevity time and all that kind of stuff. You have a good night.
All right, thank you, Bubba, for chiming in. Hannah, I do want to ask you about where the country in general, and perhaps Tennessee, if you can dial it down that much, stands on being in favor of the death penalty. What's the snapshot of that?
I think you can get a poll to say anything you want it to say.
Sure.
So some polls that show different numbers, but I think the best way of looking at this is the amount of different bills we're seeing introduced across the country. And what we're seeing there is a huge uptick in Republican lawmakers introducing bills to get rid of the death penalty in their states, about a 10% increase in the past decade. I also do think that across the polls, when you look at it, support for the death penalty is at an all-time low. Sentences are also a really good way to determine this. They're about 60% lower than they were in 2000. So we've seen a drastic drop in juries' appetite for the death penalty. And I think as a whole, right now we're in a zeitgeist moment where people are recognizing there are numerous flaws in our criminal justice system. And I think that people are starting to recognize that our system is not functioning properly. It's not really working on restoring people and making our community safer. It's wasting a lot of time and money that isn't working. And so we're starting to see really great innovations around the criminal justice system as a whole. And I think when you look at the death penalty and people start looking at the cost elements, like he says, he doesn't want to pay for someone, but you're paying so much more for them as a taxpayer when you're pursuing this kind of punishment versus just giving them a final, sentence and then move on and go after other people, and let's focus on systems that actually produce better results.
Let's talk about Billy Ray Irick. He is the inmate who is scheduled to be executed. I think, as Jason said, it's been delayed 3 times already. It could again, it could not. It is scheduled for Thursday. We're going to keep our eyes on this one. It is definitely playing out right now, and the governor still has to weigh in. He has the chance to grant him clemency. Clemency does not mean he walks out the door. Clemency would likely be life without parole. It could be anything the governor chooses, but it would likely be life without parole. This man has been convicted of raping and killing a 7-year-old little girl. But there are big questions about mental illness in this case, and that the jury who heard this case and convicted this man never knew that he was mentally ill. Tell me about the nuances with this.
Right, and again, this is how I got involved in this issue, was around mental illness issues. And I think many people think, as I did, that we already have an exclusion for people with mental illness, but we don't. We have an exclusion for people with intellectual disabilities, and then we do have something called the insanity defense, basically. The problem with that is, in most states, in order to seek that, you have to show that the person did not know what they were doing was wrong. Typically, someone with a severe mental illness or in a state of psychosis does know that killing is wrong, but their reality is so altered that they are not able to make proper decisions or show proper restraint or even understand consequences. They might think they're fighting the devil, as we have indications Billy Ray Irick had some instances around that before he committed this crime. They might think they're fighting aliens or acting in self-defense. There's no telling. What that means is they should certainly be held accountable, I still think, and I think we need to make sure they aren't an ongoing threat to society, but they certainly aren't as culpable for their crimes as other people when they're not able to make those sort of rational decisions. Even I think the most pro-death penalty people out there would say that this is supposed to be for the worst of the worst crimes. This is not the worst of the worst crimes when you're dealing with someone who is out of their mind. And I think that we have to look at how we treat these people in society. Unfortunately, if you look at Billy Ray Irick's case, he's a perfect example of someone with severe mental illness who gets the death penalty. He was institutionalized when he was 8 years old. So that's pretty severe to have a kid institutionalized at 8 years old. His family did not take him back, so he grew up mostly in an orphanage. He repeatedly tried to rejoin his family. They would not take him. He then tried to join the Army and did not pass his evaluation at that point, and then went to live with his family in Tennessee. And during the time around the crime being committed, there's plenty of evidence showing he was experiencing hallucinogenic episodes. He thought he was talking to the devil. He had tried to attack the father of this little girl at one point. He had tried to attack another child in the streets. He had been running around with a machete. What went wrong in our system to where all of this was allowed to happen, and then a tragedy occurs and we say, well, now we address this? There should have been so many other things in place to address this early on that would have prevented this tragedy versus trying to confront it on the back end once something terrible has already happened.
And even once they got to trial, even after this crime occurred and they got to trial, why didn't the jury know about this?
Right. Well, so when you have someone who has a severe mental illness, it brings a lot of elements
not always the most helpful, right? In their own defense.
So there's something called anosognosia that many people with severe mental illness has, and this is a component of severe mental illness that essentially means they aren't aware of their own illness. So due to this, they will frequently try to represent themselves. They will fire their attorneys on a whim. They almost always do not want their illness brought up at trial and will try to prevent it from being brought up because they don't believe it to be true. On top of that, they're typically not able to assist in their own defense. So to say, I was institutionalized when I was 8 years old, that's not something you're going to see happen from someone who has psychosis and is out of their mind. And so there were various factors going on, and I'm not a lawyer, and this happened over 30 years ago, so before I was alive. What we know about mental illness from then to now is drastically different. I mean, I don't know what they had at their disposal then, but I do know what we found in looking back over his life and in the years since, and it's pretty shocking that these things weren't brought up at trial. This mental illness is supposed to be considered a mitigating factor, which is just a legal term that means, you know, it should make a jury consider a sentence less than death. They weren't given that information. So.
And I was reading an article that says, as noted in the Nashville scene, the psychologist who originally assessed Irick's mental state argued against an insanity defense, essentially retracted his report years later after reviewing additional evidence. So that's kind of where we are right now. Several people have examined him and said, we've got a problem here, folks. He is not mentally stable. He should not be executed. And again, the U.S. Supreme Court has said minors can't be executed, those with intellectual disabilities cannot be executed, and those who are insane. But insanity does not equal mental illness. There's a big difference there, and there's a lot of gray area that comes with mental illness, and that's where we're kind of tripped up right now as a nation is, well, what qualifies, what doesn't, how do we assess that, what do we believe, and then what do we do? Is that fair?
Absolutely, and I think especially for anyone who's maybe on the fence about death penalty issues, just starting with the mental illness component, I think most people can agree we should not be executing with people with severe mental illness. And while this case might be a bit more clear-cut than others on the guilt factor, frequently with people with severe mental illness, it's not. We've found in studies that of people who falsely admitted to a crime, 75% of them had severe mental illness. They are much more likely to not understand the Miranda rights, to be susceptible to police pressure, to again not be able to assist in their own defense. So when you come to the innocence issues with people with severe mental illness, it's already high in our system, but it is so much higher when you're dealing with people that have these disorders.
I want to also talk about the impact that you have seen this have on those in the correction system who are tasked with carrying out the death penalty. This is their job to do. And I, as a journalist and someone who has witnessed an execution as a member of the media, I witnessed the last execution in Kentucky as a media witness for it. You see to some aspect the role that this team has to play, the execution team. And it's very secretive.
Yes.
You never know their names. They're behind pane glass where you can't see them during the actual execution. People within the system are not supposed to know who they are except for the own members of the team and the warden of that prison. It's very much shrouded in secrecy, but some folks have spoken out afterwards. And what have you found? Yeah,
we actually have seen a couple people in Tennessee this week come out who have been participants who wanted to talk about the ramifications they've experienced from participating. A lot of them who have been willing to say anything have said they've experienced PTSD. Several of them have said they developed alcoholism or drug addiction issues and had trouble sleeping, and it really messed with them psychologically as well. I think that when you ask someone to take someone else's life, I think there's so many people who say, I would do it in a minute. Would you really? Would you really? I don't think that it would be nearly as easy as you think when you're in that room and you're in that moment. And unfortunately, we are at a place where our government is asking people to do this on our behalf. I don't think that's fair or right. And we've seen really terrible side effects for that. And for other people who have witnessed it, like yourself, I've fortunately never had to be in that position to see that, but I'm sure it would be quite traumatizing to see a life taken in front of you, and we're certainly seeing people start to open up about that.
We both just listened to a podcast. We were talking about this before the show. It's on Criminal is the podcast, and the gal was interviewing a warden, and we believe it was the Nevada prison, which he helped carry out 2 executions, and then the state, I think, put a stay on him. But and he said, and this struck me at the end, because he said, it was very traumatizing as a whole to have to do this. It was his job, but it was traumatizing. And he said at the end of it, he said, I think if we have a jury that convicts somebody and sentences them to die, we should also have a system that calls upon American citizens and says, okay, carry it out. You are now the jury that carries this out. And he says, I think we would see a very big change in opinion and how the death penalty is imposed.
Right, because you're very far removed from it. And another thing that we've seen happening a lot more frequently, there's all these issues with the drugs, the lethal injection drugs going on. States are getting somewhat desperate to get certain cocktails because companies are saying, we don't want our medicines that we've developed used in this manner, which I think as a conservative, that's a freedom of association issue that should certainly be respected. Instead, we see states trying to get around it, and I think let's
talk about that right after the break, because that is a big deal right now, as we see with this very case where Billy Ray Irick is part of this lawsuit. So, okay, it is your chance to chime in. I know you've got opinions about this, questions perhaps that you're trying to wade through yourself. Go ahead and give us a call. 615-737-PLUS is the number to call. We'll talk about that drug protocol when we come back. Stay with us.